unbiased reveal channel. Friends, buckle up, because today we're diving straight into a high-stakes wrestling match that's been simmering for decades, but now it's absolutely boiling over.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about the Federal Reserve. You know, the supposed paragon of monetary policy independence, locked in this ferocious, no-holds-barred conflict with the White House, specifically under President Donald Trump.
It's quite the drama.
Totally. On one side, you've got the president demanding interest rate cuts like they're going out of style, promising economic salvation.
Yeah, pushing hard for those cuts.
And on the other, you have Fed Chair Jerome Powell just steadfastly insisting on this data-dependent approach, clinging to stability like a life raft in a storm.
Right, holding the line.
And look, this isn't just some dusty political disagreement, right?
Right.
It's a centuries-old tug-of-war with global economic implications where the stakes are, frankly, massive and the explosive points are just everywhere.
Indeed. And in this deep dive, we're doing more than just skimming the headlines. Our mission, really, is to peel back the intricate layers of history, trace this enduring tension between the U.S. government and its central bank.
Yeah, get into the weeds a bit.
Exactly. We'll explore the curious path the Fed took to gain its independence, the presidents who tried their hardest to, well, dismantle it.
Or at least bend it to their will.
Precisely. And the often surprising consequences of those battles and what this current showdown truly means for you, your wallet, and, yeah, the global economy.
It's a huge story.
It is. It's a fascinating story of power, principle, and, let's be honest, the occasionally absurd dance between political ambition and economic reality.
Absolutely. This isn't just dry economic theory. It's a profound drama with real consequences for everyone. So let's delve into the core of American monetary power. The Federal Reserve's DNA. Built for independence, but always challenged.
So to really understand the current dynamic, we kind of need to go back to the very beginning. What exactly is the Federal Reserve and how was it initially conceived?
Good question. For those who might need a quick refresher on its origins, the Fed was established way back in 1913 by the Federal Reserve Act. The original vision was quite decentralized, actually.
Huh.
A system of 12 regional reserve banks, each with a fair bit of autonomy, overseen by a board in Washington, D.C.
Right. That regional structure is key.
And the legal framework famously described it as independent but supervised, a unique entity, specifically designed not to be a direct part of the executive, legislative, or judicial branches. But here's the crucial detail. In its initial years, that independence was largely theoretical.
Yeah, more on paper than in practice.
It was heavily, and I mean heavily, influenced by the U.S. Treasury. So the grand design for autonomy was there on paper, but the reality was still, playing catch-up.
And that's precisely where the forging of independence truly began. The pivotal moment arrived with the Banking Act of 1935. This act wasn't just another piece of legislation. It completed a major restructuring that had been ongoing since the Hoover and early Roosevelt administrations.
Right during the Depression.
Exactly. Its explicit aim was, and I'm quoting here, to provide for the sound, effective, and uninterrupted operation of the banking system. It marked a foundational shift from temporary crisis-driven measures to permanent systemic reforms.
So the 1935 Act was pivotal. Beyond just setting it up, what were the most significant sort of practical shifts it brought about that truly empowered the Fed?
Well, this act fundamentally centralized power. It shifted it from those 12 regional reserve banks much more firmly to a newly empowered board of governors in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so power flows to the center.
Right. And this meant a new leadership structure. For instance, the chief executive of the board, previously called the governor, officially became the chairman of the board of governors, combining former roles to create a clearer, more powerful central figure.
Got it. One boss.
And down in the regional banks, their governors became presidents and vice governors became first vice president.
So effectively moving from a loose confederation, like you said, to a strong central command. Did this shift in power ever face significant internal pushback from the regional banks themselves? I mean, it sounds like a pretty dramatic redistribution of authority.
Oh, it was definitely a dramatic shift. And while the act passed, the debate leading up to it certainly reflected differing views, on the optimal balance between centralized control and regional autonomy. There was pushback.
I bet.
But the very change in titles itself carried immense symbolic and legal significance. It reflected a global tradition where the head of a central bank held the title of governor, like the Bank of England since 1694.
Oh, okay.
The previous setup, where regional bank heads were governors, suggested more of a confederation, like you said. The 1935 Act explicitly dismantled that consolidating authority. I mean, every single power had to be carefully reallocated in the legal text, signaling a decisive move towards a unified national monetary policy.
That's a subtle but powerful signal of intent. But how did these changes specifically enhance independence from the executive branch, from presidential pressure? Because that's the core firewall we're talking about today, right?
This was a critical component, absolutely. The act removed the Secretary of the Treasury and the controller of the currency from the Federal Reserve Board after 1936.
Whoa, they were on the board before.
Yes. Prior to this, the Treasury Secretary actually served as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board.
No kidding. So a direct line.
A direct, almost unavoidable line of influence. Removing them was a clear statement of separation, a physical and symbolic break. And furthermore, the Fed physically moved its meetings from the Treasury Department to its brand new building on Constitution Avenue, consolidating its staff there in 1937.
Literally moved out.
It was a literal step away from Treasury's shadow.
Talk about taking your toys and going home. That's a pretty clear signal.
I know.
But beyond separate buildings, there's a more fundamental reason why these officials can resist presidential pressure, right?
Yeah.
It's about their terms of office.
You're hitting on the core of its design. The terms for Board of Governors members were extended to a remarkably long 14 years.
14 years.
14 years, and crucially, they are non-renewable. This was a deliberate design choice, specifically intended to disconnect them from electoral cycles.
Right, so they don't have to worry about getting reappointed by the current president.
Exactly. The idea was that their decisions shouldn't be swayed by the immediate political calendar or the whims of a single administration. Now, the chairman and vice chairman are appointed for renewable 4-year terms, but even those terms are staggered.
How so?
They come up for renewal in the second year of a U.S. president's term. So a newly elected president can't immediately just appoint a full new slate to exert control. It slows things down.
14 years. That's practically a lifetime in political terms. It sounds like they were trying to build a genuine fortress against short-term political whims. What about their actual tools for monetary policy? Did the act give them more muscle there?
Absolutely. The act centralized control over the most important tool of monetary policy, open market operations, or BOMOs.
Buying and selling bonds, right?
Exactly. The Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, in its modern structure, was created by the 1935 Act. Its voting members now consisted of the 7 board governors, the president of the New York Fed, who always has a vote, and the presidents of 4 other regional banks on a rotating basis.
Okay, so a specific structure for decision-making.
And this replaced earlier, more voluntary committees, making the FOMC's decisions binding on all reserve banks. This meant a coordinated national monetary policy rather than individual banks pursuing independent, potentially conflicting policies.
So no more rogue regional banks deciding their own adventures in the market, a truly unified front. And what about interest rates and reserve requirements? Those are pretty big levers.
Indeed. The Act authorized the board to set reserve requirements for deposits at member banks. These requirements dictate how much cash banks must hold in reserve, which directly impacts their lending capacity.
Big impact on credit.
Huge. And while initial drafts had more overt changes to the discount rate, that's the interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow directly from the Fed, the final act enhanced the board's authority by requiring banks to submit the proposed discount rates to the board every 14 days for review and determination.
So oversight, even if it's not direct setting initially.
It gave the board significant oversight and influence, yes.
Okay, so this 1935 Act sounds like a major turning point for the Fed's power and structure. What about the broader banking system? Any other big changes from this period that impact us today?
Yes. 2 significant changes in Titles 4 and 3 of the Act address the broader banking system, and they have profound long-term consequences. Title I prominently established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC.
The FDIC. Everyone knows that sticker on the bank door.
Exactly. It had been a temporary program since 1933, born out of the Depression bank runs. This made it permanent, providing deposit insurance, guaranteeing depositors their money up to a certain limit, even if a bank failed.
Crucial for confidence.
Absolutely. And it designated the FDIC as the liquidator for failed banks. This offered a crucial safety net for depositors, significantly bolstering public confidence in the banking system after the chaos of the early 30s.
Huge for public confidence, I imagine, especially after all those bank runs.
Yeah.
What else? You mentioned Title III.
Right. Title III eliminated something called double liability for bank shareholders.
Double liability. What's that?
From 1863 right up to 1935. If a bank failed, shareholders not only lost their initial investment, but also potentially an additional amount, typically equal to the par value of their shares, say $100 per share.
Wow, so you could lose double your money.
Exactly. This was intended to incentivize bank managers and shareholders to prioritize safety to have skin in the game. But it also greatly deterred investment in banks, especially after the widespread failures of the early 1930s, and it severely hindered recovery.
Made people scared to own bank stock.
Understandably. So the 1935 Act removed it to speed financial system recovery by making bank investment less risky for shareholders.
So less personal risk for investors, but it sounds like it shifted more systemic risk onto the FDIC and ultimately the public. A trade-off, perhaps?
That's a very insightful way to put it. It was a trade-off.
I'm sensing a theme here. Crisis leads to reform, which then often has unforeseen long-term consequences. What's the bottom line on why this independence, solidified by these reforms, truly matters?
You've hit on a critical point. While reducing direct risk for shareholders, it did shift the burden of bank failures more onto the FDIC and ultimately the public, a change that drew little opposition at the time, but as you say, has been noted for its long-term effects on risk-taking in the financial system. But the core principle behind the Fed's independence, forged by these reforms, remains vital. Countries with more independent central banks generally experience lower inflation without compromising average employment over the long run.
Lower inflation, stable jobs. That's the goal.
Right. Conversely, when politicians control central banks, history shows it often leads to higher inflation and economic instability. Why? Because there's a huge temptation to force the central bank to effectively print money to finance government deficits.
Monetizing the debt.
Exactly, monetizing debt, which almost always sparks inflation down the road. This independence isn't just some ivory tower ideal, it's really, you could say, a firewall forged in crisis against economic chaos. It's about protecting the economy from politicians who might be tempted to print their way out of problems.
Which always sounds good in the short term.
Always sounds good short term, but can turn into an inflationary nightmare later on. A century of will they or won't they? Presidential versus Fed showdowns.
So, with that sturdy foundation laid, let's jump into the juicy bits. The century-long saga of presidents trying to boss around the Fed. Because let's be real, who doesn't love a good showdown?
Chuckles. Right. And the early years were certainly a testament to the Fed's theoretical rather than actual independence. Take the gold standard dilemma before 1934.
The gold standard. Always tricky.
The Fed was required to maintain a 40% gold backing for currency issuance. During the 1929 Great Depression, gold reserves plunged from $4.5 billion down to $3.2 billion.
Ouch.
This rigid requirement forced the Fed to tighten policy, raise interest rates precisely when economic stimulus was desperately needed. It actually made the crisis worse, deepened the depression.
All the irony. A system designed for stability inadvertently forcing austerity during a depression. Then came FDR, right? The king of executive action, known for his bold moves.
Indeed. President Roosevelt seized the moment with the 1934 Gold Reserve Act. He effectively abandoned the gold standard for domestic purposes and nationalized gold, transferring the Fed's gold directly to the Treasury.
Just took it.
Basically, yes. This stripped the Fed of its gold-related functions and left monetary policy, things like discount rates, largely subservient to the Treasury's urgent need to finance massive government debt, especially as the nation was grappling with the Depression. The Fed chair at the time, Mariner Eccles, even famously joked he was merely an administrative assistant to the Treasury Secretary. It truly was a significant presidential power grab, severely limiting the Fed's autonomy.
An administrative assistant. Ouch. That's a pretty brutal demotion for what's supposed to be a powerful entity.
Yeah.
And then came World War II, which I imagine didn't exactly help the Fed's independence streak.
Not at all. During World War II, the Fed lost even its nominal independence. It was compelled, essentially forced, to purchase government bonds at incredibly low, fixed rates below 2.5% solely to aid war financing.
Pegging the rates low.
Exactly. It effectively functioned as little more than an appendage of the Treasury. Its monetary policy was explicitly subordinated to the Treasury's fiscal needs to fund the war effort. So in these early years, particularly before 1951, the Fed's independence was largely theoretical, just overshadowed by the Treasury's objectives.
The truly subservient role. But then a classic family drama unfolds. The Great Divorce, the 1951 Monetary Accord. This sounds like a moment where the Fed finally drew a line in the sand.
This was a critical turning point, absolutely. With the Korean War heating up, President Truman sought to continue the wartime arrangement, having the Fed buy government bonds at those low, fixed rates to keep government borrowing costs down for the war effort.
Keep the cheap money flowing.
Right. But having witnessed inflation soar above 9% due to the prior money printing during WWII, the Fed, under Chairman McCabe, finally pushed back. They refused Truman's demands to perpetuate this inflationary policy.
They said no. Imagine that. A real, this time it's different moment. But then the Treasury pulled a sneaky one, right? A tricky move, as our source calls it.
Precisely. Truman's Treasury Secretary, John Snyder, publicly and falsely announced that the Fed had agreed to the bond buying plan. He was trying to pressure them into compliance through public declaration.
Wow, just lied about it.
Essentially, yes. The Fed chair, McCabe, was understandably furious and unwilling to be manipulated. He immediately countered, stating publicly that if Treasury remained aggressive, the Fed would unilaterally make its policy decisions without consultation. This led to about a month of intense public conflict, which threatened to destabilize markets.
It sounds like a high-stakes game of chicken. Who ultimately blinked first, and what was the lasting outcome?
The Treasury ultimately conceded. After that month of public sparring, the 1951 Monetary Accord was signed. It formally ended the Fed's obligation to buy bonds at fixed rates, freeing it to conduct monetary policy based on economic conditions, not just Treasury financing needs.
The birth of real independence.
This accord is widely considered the true birth of modern Federal Reserve independence. It allowed the Fed to pursue monetary policy decisions based on economic conditions rather than political expediency. It was a huge step.
A major win.
A major win for independence. The human cost, however, was that Chairman McCabe resigned as a concession, part of the deal. He was replaced by William McChesney Martin, Jr., who was actually a Treasury Assistant Secretary involved in negotiating the accord.
Ah, so they lost the general but won the war. And this Treasury insider, William McChesney Martin, Jr., who was maybe supposed to be the White House's guy, turns out to be the unexpected champion of independence. How does that happen?
It's quite the twist of fate, isn't it? Martin became the longest-serving Fed chair, holding the position for an incredible 19 years, a testament to his tenacity and skill.
19 years.
Yes, and a Federal Reserve building in D.C. is even named in his honor. He wasn't just some bureaucrat, he was a genuine Wall Street prodigy. Became a partner at a brokerage firm at 22, an NYSE board member at 29, and NYSE president at 31.
Wow, a real whiz kid.
Absolutely. And under his tenure, the U.S. experienced remarkable price stability. Average inflation was only 1.3% from 1952 to 1965, a period often dubbed the Martin Miracle.
A miracle indeed. So this Wall Street prodigy, who started as the Treasury's pick, ends up being the one who stood up to presidents. Give us the juicy details of his principled stance.
Well, he famously stood firm against President Lyndon B. Johnson during the Vietnam War. That was a period of escalating fiscal demands from the war and growing inflationary pressures.
LBJ was known for his persuasive tactics.
Very persuasive. But Martin even increased interest rates by 1% in 1965, despite Johnson's immense pressure to keep rates low. Johnson reputedly complained, very pointedly, "Our children are making sacrifices in Vietnam and you won't print money."
Wow, that's direct pressure.
It's a powerful illustration of that political temptation to fund wars by monetizing debt. Martin, described as an eagle for his time meaning hawkish on inflation, prioritized controlling perceived economic overheating even when inflation was still below 2%. He focused on long-term stability.
Our children are making sacrifices and you won't print money. That's a classic. It perfectly encapsulates the perennial conflict between immediate political needs and long-term economic stability.
So, was Martin always this unyielding, or did he have a softer side, a pragmatic streak?
He was generally strong on principle, but he also showed a degree of flexibility. He understood the political landscape. He made some concessions under pressure from President Eisenhower back in 1953 and later from President Kennedy in the 1960s.
Knew when to pick his battles.
Exactly. His style was characterized as strong in principle, intermittently yielding. He knew when to bend a little, perhaps, to preserve his ability to stand firm on core principles later. He wasn't needlessly confrontational.
Smart.
He also initiated the tradition of regular four-person meetings: the Fed chair, Treasury Secretary, White House Budget Director, and the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for crucial dialogue and coordination.
Keeping lines of communication open. Right. And that tradition, incidentally, continues today, like the reported breakfast meetings between Powell and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and now presumably Yellen. It's a means of communication and coordination without explicit policy direction. You know, the path to independence isn't always a straight line. Sometimes you have to know when to bend a little, just enough to stand firm tomorrow. His era really cemented the Fed's growing autonomy.
Fascinating insight into the subtle art of central banking. But then came the Nixon-Burns saga, a period when independence didn't just bend, it seemingly crumbled. What happened then?
Yes, a painful and cautionary chapter in the Fed's history. President Nixon had campaigned hard on revitalizing the American economy, reducing unemployment. He was furious with Martin's continued rate hikes, which he saw as directly impeding his economic agenda before the '72 election.
So Nixon wanted easier money.
Desperately. But he couldn't legally fire Martin due to his fixed term. So Nixon pulled a different move. He announced Arthur Burns as the next Fed chair a full year before Martin's term even ended.
A year early.
Yes. Effectively undermining and sidelining Martin in a blatant act of political pressure made him a lame duck. And this is a crucial conflict point to consider. Could a current president use this same tactic on a sitting Fed chair today, effectively rendering them powerless through anticipation?
That's an explosive point right there.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine the market chaos if that happened today. So what happened once Burns was officially in office? Did he live up to Nixon's expectations of compliance?
Sadly, for Fed independence, yes. Once in office, Burns' policy style was described by many observers as obedient. He immediately cut interest rates upon taking office and did so again in 1972, actions widely seen as aimed at supporting Nixon's re-election bid.
So direct political influence on rates.
And the infamous Watergate tapes later confirmed this direct political pressure. In one recorded call, Burns told Nixon, "Mr. President, I want you to know I have lowered the discount rate to 4.5%, almost like reporting mission accomplished."
Yeah.
Nixon responded with 3 enthusiastic goods. In another recording, Burns stated, quite remarkably, "I feel I have done everything I can to help you become president and solidify your standing in American history."
Chuckles slightly. I've done everything I can to help you. It sounds less like a central banker making independent economic decisions and more like a campaign manager delivering a political favor. The eagerness is almost painful, a stark contrast to Martin's principled stance. What was the ultimate cost of this compliance for the Fed's independence and the broader economy?
Well, this period clearly saw the Fed's independence severely compromised. Its policy decisions were overtly influenced by political objectives, not just economic data, and the cost was significant. Those easy money policies are widely seen as contributing to the surge in inflation in the 1970s, setting the stage for one of the most challenging economic periods in modern U.S. history, stagflation.
The dreaded stagflation.
Exactly. But there was an unintended yet ultimately positive consequence of Burns's perceived failures. Congress reacted. They significantly increased oversight of the Fed. They clarified the Fed's dual mandate to maintain both price stability and maximum employment, and they mandated those semi-annual monetary policy reports to Congress, requiring the chair to testify before both houses.
The Humphrey Hawkins testimony.
Precisely. These are the famous, sometimes called prisoner hearings, where the chair faces intense questioning for hours, twice a year. This institutionalized scrutiny was aimed squarely at preventing future political subservience, a direct response to the perceived failings under Burns. It shows that sometimes the biggest setbacks pave the way for the strongest comebacks, even if it feels like a public grilling at the time.
So essentially, Congress put the Fed in a very public biennial timeout to ensure accountability. That's a fantastic turn of events, showing how crucial institutional checks are. But if Burns was the Fed's low point, then Paul Volcker was his undisputed rock star. The Volcker shock independence forged in fire. How did this towering figure change the game?
Absolutely. Paul Volcker took the helm in August 1979, facing arguably the most dire U.S. economic conditions since the Great Depression. Soaring 14% inflation, 7.5% unemployment, and that toxic mix of economic stagnation and rising prices, stagflation.
Terrible combination.
Terrible. And Volcker, notably tall at over 2 meters, was just uncompromisingly committed to crushing inflation. He believed it was the paramount threat eroding the economy and public trust.
Laser focus.
Total laser focus. He famously hiked the federal funds rate from around 11% when he took office to a peak of over 20% by 1981. An unprecedented and incredibly aggressive series of moves.
Over 20%. That's not just a hike, that's a monumental climb. What was the immediate impact of such a drastic move on everyday lives and the economy?
While the impact was severe, these aggressive hikes directly caused the most severe post-World War II recession up to that point. Unemployment soared to 10.8% in late 1982. Businesses failed, farms went under across the country. It was incredibly painful for millions of Americans.
Huge economic pain.
Huge pain. And Volcker faced immense pressure, not just political, but personal. There were threats to his safety. There were constant attempts at intervention from both President Carter, who appointed him, and then President Reagan, who inherited him. Both were deeply concerned about the economic fallout and, frankly, their political futures.
Understandably.
But Volcker famously refused White House invitations and calls aimed at influencing policy. He asserted very clearly that the Fed does not serve any political party, but rather the long-term health of the economy.
He just said no to the president, flat out. That takes some serious guts, especially when the economy is in such turmoil and his policies are causing widespread pain. How did it all ultimately pay off, despite the immediate suffering?
The Volcker miracle, as it's sometimes called, saw inflation plummet dramatically. It went from 13.5% in 1980 down to 3.2% by 1983. His decisive, even deeply unpopular action proved the efficacy of high interest rates against entrenched inflation.
Broke the back of inflation.
Exactly. And it really paved the way for over 2 decades of U.S. economic vitality and growth, the period often referred to as the Great Moderation. Crucially, it also dramatically enhanced global market confidence in the U.S. dollar, cementing its status as the world's primary reserve currency.
Solidified the dollar's dominance.
Absolutely. And it established, maybe reestablish price stability as the paramount mission of the Fed, especially when it conflicts with short-term employment goals. You know, true independence isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about standing firm when the entire world wants you to buckle. Volcker didn't just preserve independence. He fundamentally strengthened it through sheer force of will and principle.
That's a powerful legacy. Then came Alan Greenspan, the master of ambiguity. After such a clear, almost blunt approach from Volcker, how did Greenspan navigate the often turbulent waters of presidential relationships and maintain the Fed's hard-won independence?
Alan Greenspan served as Fed chair for an incredible 18.5 years, spanning 4 presidencies. Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., making him the second longest tenured chair in history after Martin. A long run.
A very long run. And he was renowned for his deliberately vague, sometimes convoluted, and often paradoxical statements. His communication style was legendary. He famously quipped, "If you understood what I said, you must have misunderstood my meaning."
Chuckles. If you understood what I said, you must have misunderstood my meaning.
That's a masterclass in elusiveness, almost like Fed speak became an art form. But seriously, how did this cryptic communication style actually help him maintain the Fed's independence and manage expectations?
Well, Greenspan masterfully navigated the demands of both markets and the Treasury. He prioritized clear communication, paradoxically, by sometimes being deliberately unclear, if that makes sense.
Keep him guessing.
Sort of. He was adept at aligning market expectations without explicitly committing the Fed to a particular path too early. His tenure saw the Fed's influence arguably reach its zenith. Presidents reportedly did not dare to complain openly about his policies, recognizing his immense prestige and the market's deep trust in him.
The maestro.
Exactly. He preserved the Fed's independence through a blend of firmness when needed, but also pragmatic flexibility. He ensured cooperation with administrations without capitulation. His approach underscored that sometimes the strongest stance is taken with the most artful language, keeping everyone guessing but knowing who's ultimately in charge.
A different style, but effective in its own way.
Very effective for a long time. Although later critiques did emerge, particularly after the 2008 crisis, regarding his relatively lax oversight of financial derivatives and maybe contributing to the conditions that led to the crisis. But during his tenure, independence was strong.
And this brings us to the post-financial crisis era under Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. Their independence seemed quite strong, but it felt like the stars were perhaps aligned for them in a unique way, maybe.
You're right, that's a good way to put it. During and immediately after the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed's policies were pretty radical but necessary. Things like bringing interest rates down to effectively zero.
ZRP, zero interest rate policy.
Right. and implementing massive rounds of quantitative easing, or QE, plus buying vast amounts of government bonds and mortgage-backed securities to lower long-term interest rates and inject liquidity into a frozen financial system.
QE, basically printing money to buy assets.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
The Fed creates new digital money to buy these financial assets from commercial banks, thereby increasing the money supply and encouraging lending and investment when traditional interest rate cuts weren't enough. And these actions, while controversial in some circles, naturally coincided with the government's broader objectives under both Bush and Obama: stabilize the financial system, prevent a deeper depression, and stimulate economic recovery.
So it wasn't so much a battle as a harmonious duet. When everyone wants the same thing, lower rates, more liquidity, conflict tends to take a holiday, at least publicly.
Exactly, because the needs of the market, which desperately needed that liquidity and lower rates to recover, and the needs of the government, which was facing a massive recession and needed to stimulate growth, were largely in sync. So there was much less public friction between the Fed and the White House during the Bernanke and Yellen tenures compared to other eras.
They were pushing in the same direction.
Right. While both chairmen certainly maintained their independence in decision-making and faced their own internal debates, the external pressures pushing them towards accommodative policy were less confrontational than, say, what Martin or Volcker face.
And now we arrive at the modern battle. Trump versus Powell. A too-late showdown indeed. This one feels like a live-action Twitter feud played out in the highest echelons of power.
It certainly has a very public, almost theatrical dimension, unlike anything we've really seen before in terms of presidential criticism of the Fed. Since 2018, President Trump has relentlessly and publicly attacked Fed Chair Jerome Powell using extremely strong personal language.
Yeah, dummy, stupid person.
Calling him a dummy, a stupid person, and famously, too late Powell, because he's supposedly always too late to cut rates. He's demanded immediate deep interest rate cuts, often pointing to European central banks, which he claimed had implemented 10 cuts while the U.S. had none, which wasn't quite accurate, but that was the rhetoric.
Right, using Europe as a benchmark or a cudgel.
Exactly. Trump claimed Powell was costing America $1 billion by keeping rates too high. He specifically suggested Powell should cut rates by a huge 2.5 percentage points to save billions on what he called Biden's short-term debt, especially given what Trump perceived as low inflation. The drama unfolded almost daily via Twitter and public remarks.
Meanwhile, Powell, from what we've seen, maintains a remarkably stoic and consistent public stance, doesn't he? Almost channeling Greenspan's careful phrasing sometimes.
He does. Powell consistently states the Fed is data-dependent and absolutely committed to its independence. He repeats that mantra constantly. And despite inflation recently being controlled below 3%, Powell paused rate cuts at various points, citing high policy uncertainty.
Uncertainty left.
Well, especially considering the potential impact of Trump's own tariff proposals. While aimed at boosting domestic industry, tariffs could also reignite inflation by increasing the cost of imported goods. This creates a really difficult balancing act for the Fed trying to manage inflation while navigating unpredictable trade policy shifts.
But Trump wasn't just tweeting insults, was he? He escalated with direct threats and suggestions about Powell's job security. That felt like crossing a line.
He did. Trump threatened to fire Powell, claiming publicly, if I want him gone, he won't last long, and even suggesting he could do a much better job himself.
Wow.
However, he later softened his stance, stating he had no intention of removing Powell. Remember, Powell's term as chair extends to May 2026, and importantly, his term as a governor runs all the way until 2028.
Right. He stays on the board regardless.
Exactly, and this apparent retreat on the firing threat followed strong pushback, reportedly from within his own administration, and a general consensus among legal experts, which is buttressed by Supreme Court precedent, that the president lacks the authority to fire the Fed chair simply for policy disagreements.
It's not like The Apprentice.
Chuckles. No. It's akin to a complex labor arbitration case for the nation's top economist. You'd need just cause, like proven gross negligence or illegality, not simply disagreeing on where interest rates should be.
So the core conflict is quite clear. Trump wants lower rates, primarily to alleviate fiscal pressure, reducing the cost of government borrowing, and also to weaken the dollar to boost U.S. manufacturing competitiveness. That's his goal.
All right.
Powell, on the other hand, concerned about potential inflation, maybe from tariffs, maybe from an already tight labor market, prefers to wait for clear, consistent data, confirming sustained price cooling and stable economic conditions before adjusting rates further. He's focused on the mandate,
That's the crux of it. And it's not just Trump pushing, right? Other politicians have chimed in on this debate from various angles.
Yeah, who else?
Well, Trump's Treasury Secretary at the time, Steven Mnuchin, reportedly met with Powell weekly for breakfast, engaging in what was described by insiders as soft-shoeing, a subtle, ongoing attempt to influence policy direction without overt demands.
The gentle nudge approach.
Right. And other politicians, like Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno, echoed Trump's criticisms more directly, accusing the Fed of intellectually dishonest circular logic regarding tariffs and inflation, essentially arguing the Fed was using tariffs as an excuse not to cut rates as much as Trump wanted.
So pressure from the right. What about the left?
Interestingly, pressure also came from the other side. Senator Elizabeth Warren, for example, publicly urged Powell to move more rapidly to bring down interest rates, arguing it would support employment and reduce debt burdens for consumers and businesses. So Powell was getting pressure from multiple political directions.
Caught in the middle.
Very much so. Yet throughout this chorus of voices, Powell consistently emphasizes the Fed's political independence and unwavering commitment to its dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment. You know, in the arena of economic policy, sometimes the most cutting remarks come from the highest offices, yet the target remains steadfast, or at least tries to appear so.
How presidents try to tame the Fed and why it's so hard.
So presidents employ a few key strategies, a kind of playbook, to try and influence the Fed. But as we've seen, they invariably face significant institutional hurdles. The first is what you might call the people strategy, focusing on appointments and influence through personnel.
The classic put your people in power move. Makes sense. But firing the chair, that's not as easy as a reality TV show firing, is it? We just heard Trump try it and seemingly back down.
Not at all. As we discussed, a U.S. president cannot arbitrarily fire the Fed chair just because they don't like their interest rate policy. The standard is just cause, proven legal violations, gross dereliction of duty, moral turpitude, documented mental incapacity, things like that.
A very high bar.
Extremely high. It really is like that labor arbitration scenario we mentioned, with a very high legal standard for dismissal, designed specifically to protect the Fed's operational independence from short-term political whims.
So unless Powell, commits some truly outlandish illegal act, he's basically glued to that chair until his term is up. But what about terms? Don't they eventually expire, allowing a president to shape the board over time?
Yes, that's the main avenue for influence. The chair serves a renewable 4-year term, and Powell's current term as chairman ends in May 2026. However, the Board of Governors members serve those much longer, non-renewable 14-year terms.
14 years non-renewable.
With one such term expiring every 2 years on January 31st of even-numbered years. So even if Powell's chairmanship ends in 2026, his governorship continues until 2028, meaning he would retain his vote on the FOMC.
Still has a vote.
Still has a vote. And this staggered long-term structure makes it incredibly difficult for any single president to quickly stack the board with sympathetic appointees. It takes many years, often spanning multiple administrations, to significantly alter the board's overall composition and philosophical leaning.
So it's a slow burn.
The very slow burn. Presidents typically aim to appoint doves, those generally favoring looser, more stimulative monetary policy, to the board vacancies to try and influence the FOMC's overall leanings over time. But it's an incremental process.
So it's like slowly stacking the deck over years rather than a quick flip. Patience, something not always associated with presidential power. What about Nixon's shadow chair tactic? Could that effectively be used today, making a chair a lame duck even if they can't technically be fired?
That's a really interesting question. A president could theoretically attempt Nixon's tactic of pre-announcing a successor well before the current chair's term is up. It would effectively create a shadow chair and potentially a lame duck situation for the incumbent.
Undermine their authority.
Exactly. While Trump hasn't done that yet with Powell, it remains a potential conflict point for you, the listener, to consider. It's a historical precedent that could resurface. Of course, such a move would almost certainly generate significant market uncertainty and huge political controversy, but it is a tool that exists in the historical playbook, albeit one with its own considerable risks.
A real explosive point to ponder while you're commuting. But it's not just about the chair, is it? The Fed isn't a dictatorship. It's a collective, a committee making decisions.
Precisely. That's fundamental. Major Fed decisions, particularly on interest rates and the size of the money supply through QE or QT, are made by that 12-member Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, and all 12 votes are equal.
12 equal votes.
7 are the governors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The other 5 are rotating regional reserve bank presidents. This collective decision-making body further dilutes the influence of any single appointment, or even the chair. The chair needs to build consensus to be effective.
Can't just dictate.
No. And even if a president appoints people perceived as doves, they might find that once confirmed and inside the institution, these individuals prioritize the Fed's institutional independence and its economic mandate over past political loyalties. We saw that quite clearly with William McChesney Martin Jr., didn't we? Appointed from Treasury, became a champion of independence.
That makes sense. Power diffused is harder to control.
Yeah.
So what's the paper strategy? Does it involve using executive orders to try and rein in the Fed?
Yes, the paper strategy involves executive orders, but crucially, with significant limits when it comes to the Fed's core monetary policy functions. We saw an example recently. In February 2025, President Trump issued Executive Order 14215.
What do they do?
It aimed to increase White House oversight over many independent agencies across the government. It required these agencies to submit major regulatory actions to the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, for review, and also mandated more regular communication with the White House. It was widely seen as an attempt to assert greater executive branch control over the vast bureaucracy of independent agencies.
Sounds like a power grab on the surface, extending the president's reach over rulemaking. But there was a crucial, almost telling exception carved out for the Fed, wasn't there? A specific exclusion.
Indeed there was, and it's very significant. This executive order deliberately and explicitly excluded the Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions from this White House review process.
Explicitly excluded monetary policy.
Explicitly. This indicates that while the administration might seek to influence the Fed's regulatory powers, perhaps aiming for less stringent oversight on banks and financial institutions, for instance, it acknowledges the unique status and the market-driven limits of its power over the Fed's core monetary policy functions, like setting interest rates.
A line they wouldn't cross.
It's a subtle but powerful acknowledgement. It suggests that even the most assertive executive orders have lines they dare not cross, especially when it comes to the Fed's sacred turf of monetary policy. It speaks volumes about the perceived risks of directly interfering with the Fed's rate decisions, or MOMOs.
That's a powerful acknowledgement of boundaries, hidden in the details. Finally, there's the public strategy. The presidential megaphone. I have a feeling I know which president excels at this one.
Chuckles. The public strategy is certainly President Trump's most frequently used method, leveraging the immense power of the presidential bully pulpit, amplified by modern media and social media.
Yeah, Twitter diplomacy or Twitter attacks.
Right. This involves constant public criticism, direct personal attacks on the Fed chair, persistent comparisons to other central banks like those European rate cuts, and dire warnings about the U.S. economy, claiming America will be finished or face economic collapse if the Fed doesn't cut rates immediately.
Fear tactics, almost.
The goal here is clear. Sway public opinion, create media pressure, and indirectly pressure the Fed through shaping market and public perception, hoping they'll bend.
The ultimate megaphone strategy, bypassing direct power and going straight to public opinion. Does all that public trash talk, as the source called it, actually work in dictating Fed policy? Does Powell flinch when he reads those tweets?
Well, while these public statements are undeniably attention-grabbing and create significant headlines, most sources suggest their direct impact on Fed policy decisions is limited. Fed officials, including Powell, consistently emphasize their insulation from short-term political pressure in their public communications. They stick to the data-dependent script.
So it doesn't work.
They say it doesn't. However, some academic studies have shown that President Trump's tweets specifically about monetary policy did measurably influence financial market expectations of future Fed actions.
So the markets react.
Yes. This indicates that while the Fed itself might not directly succumb to the pressure in its formal decisions, the markets perceive some potential presidential influence, or at least increased uncertainty. This leads market participants to adjust their forecasts for future rate decisions, which in turn can influence bond yields, borrowing costs, and investment decisions in the real economy.
So it's not entirely ineffective, even if indirect.
Exactly. It doesn't directly dictate policy, but it definitely sows uncertainty, shapes expectations, and adds another layer of complexity for the Fed to navigate. And those shifting expectations can have real economic effects. The ultimate backstop. Why the Fed's independence isn't just a suggestion.
So despite all these attempts to prod, poke, and publicly shame the Fed, it seems to remain largely an immovable object to the president's unstoppable force, at least when it comes to core policy. Why is it so hard for even the most powerful person on earth to truly control it, beyond the specific legal hurdles we discussed?
It truly is a fascinating paradox, isn't it? Despite being one of the world's most powerful individuals, the U.S. president, particularly someone like Trump who pushes boundaries, finds the Federal Reserve one of the most resilient and, in some ways, helpless to control entities through direct command.
Helpless to control. Strong words.
Well, in terms of forcing specific, absolutely. The fact that Trump's recent executive order on agency oversight specifically excluded the Fed's monetary policy decisions from White House review is a very telling detail. It subtly but powerfully confirms the boundaries the White House seems unwilling or unable to cross. It suggests an understanding, perhaps advised by Treasury or others, of the profound risks involved in appearing to directly commandeer the Fed's core functions.
It signals that even within an administration pushing for deregulation and control, there's a recognition of the unique sanctity, maybe, of the Fed's monetary policy domain.
Exactly.
So what is the Fed's real bodyguard then? If it's not just legal protections or congressional oversight, what gives it that ultimate, almost unshakable resilience that even the president seems to respect, grudgingly or not?
The Fed's true bodyguard, the ultimate backstop, is arguably the market's trust.
Market trust. Explain that.
The Fed's hard-won independence, painstakingly built over decades through the principled, sometimes painful actions of figures like Martin, Volcker, and even Greenspan in his own way, is the absolute cornerstone of global market trust in the U.S. dollar and the U.S. financial system.
So independence equals credibility equals trust.
Precisely. This trust is what allows global capital, foreign central banks, corporations, investors worldwide to confidently invest trillions in U.S. dollar-denominated assets. It's why they use the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency and why they rely on U.S. Treasury bonds as the ultimate safe haven asset in times of global turmoil.
Okay, the foundation of the dollar's role.
And our source material suggests this unwavering market trust in the Fed's independence and competence is arguably far greater than the trust the market places in the day-to-day political decisions of the U.S. government itself.
The market trusts the Fed more than the government. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a bold statement, but it makes profound sense when you think about the long-term versus short-term incentives. It means any action that fundamentally undermines the Fed's independence could lead to truly catastrophic global consequences.
Indeed. It's not an exaggeration to say that. While things like trade tariffs have significant effects on specific industries and trade balances, the financial market and the dollar's role within it is deeply connected to America's core economic strength and global standing.
It's the bedrock.
It's the bedrock. Threatening that bedrock status by compromising Fed independence could lead to severe and widespread consequences, far beyond those of typical trade disputes. It could potentially spark capital flight from the U.S., make U.S. government and corporate borrowing costs skyrocket, and fundamentally destabilize global finance, which is still largely dollar-based.
A domino effect.
A huge potential domino effect. And some observers argue that Trump's persistent attacks on Powell and the Fed have already shaken market confidence to some extent. They're sometimes cited as one contributing factor, among others, to early tentative trends of de-dollarization talk in some other countries, as nations at least considered diversifying their reserves away from the dollar over the very long term.
So the rhetoric itself has consequences.
It can. And Treasury officials have reportedly warned the White House, explicitly in the past, that actions like firing Powell could spark significant market instability and severely damage U.S. economic standing globally.
So messing with the Fed's independence is like playing with a financial nuclear bomb, as one commentator put it. It's not just about tariffs or trade wars, it's about the very core of global finance. But does the market really believe Trump or any president would actually go that far, push that button given the stakes?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? While the base case assumption in the market is generally that no president would fundamentally dismantle the Fed's independence because the consequences would be just too catastrophic for everyone, including the U.S.
Right, mutually assured financial destruction.
Sort of. But the constant what if, the possibility of a sudden, unpredictable policy shift that goes beyond just verbal attacks, maybe an attempt to severely curtail its powers legislatively or through appointments aimed purely at subservience, that possibility remains a potential true black swan event for the market.
A black swan Low probability, high impact.
Exactly. A black swan is an unpredictable event with severe game-changing consequences. And the mere threat of such an event, or even just the ongoing political pressure and uncertainty generated by the attacks, introduces an element of risk that financial markets inherently dislike. It forces investors to price in a slightly higher risk premium.
Makes things jittery.
It does. It's a constant reminder that the Fed's true power isn't ultimately stored in its gold vaults or its buildings, but in the unwavering confidence of the global market, a confidence no president, however powerful or disruptive, dares to fully dismantle because the potential consequences would simply be catastrophic for the U.S. and the world economy. Outro. So we've journeyed through, what, a century of the Federal Reserve's complex history, often characterized by these wars of independence, as some call them, from its pretty humble beginnings under the Treasury's thumb.
The administrative assistant phase?
Chuckles, right? Through those dramatic clashes with presidents like Nixon and Johnson, the triumphant inflation-slaying era of Volcker, the long reign of Greenspan, and now this ongoing, very public verbal sparring between Trump and Powell.
It's been quite a ride.
It has. And the underlying tension, it seems, always remains. The Fed's institutional commitment to long-term economic stability, particularly price stability, versus the executive branch's often understandable desire for short-term economic gains, lower borrowing costs, and immediate fiscal relief. It's a captivating story, proving that even in a system designed for checks and balances, the human element, the personalities involved, and the political pressures are always at play.
Absolutely. And our conclusions seem pretty clear. While presidents will always seek to influence the Fed, it's almost baked into the system. The institutional safeguards are strong. You've got those 14-year non-renewable terms for governors, the collective decision-making of the FOMC, where the chair is just one vote.
Crucial checks.
Crucial checks. And maybe most importantly, as we just discussed, that immense global market trust placed in the Fed's independence. All these serve as powerful counterweights. It's a delicate dance, a constant negotiation, sometimes tense, sometimes cooperative, but one that has largely preserved the central bank's crucial role as a stable anchor in a pretty volatile world.
Well put. And this raises an important question maybe for you, our listener, to think about. Considering this rich historical tapestry we've walked through, how do you think future presidents will navigate this perennial friction with the Fed? Will we see more direct confrontation becoming the norm, maybe fueled by social media, or will subtle influence and behind-the-scenes negotiation remain the preferred, perhaps more effective play?
That's a great question. What's the future playbook look like? And maybe what stands out to you personally as the most surprising or impactful moment in the Fed's long quest for independence? For me, I keep coming back to the image of Volcker, just staring down two presidents during a brutal recession and basically winning. That's some serious don't mess with me energy right there.
That's definitely a defining moment. Or perhaps consider this. With global economies becoming ever more interconnected, and with new challenges like digital currencies emerging, could new forms of pressure or maybe new vulnerabilities arise for central bank independence in the future? Issues beyond the traditional presidential tug-of-war we focused on today.
Ooh, good point. The landscape is always changing. Fascinating stuff, right? Remember, the Fed's independence isn't just some abstract ivory tower ideal. Our source called it a firewall forged in crisis against economic chaos.
And maybe true independence isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about standing firm when the entire world wants you to buckle. Volcker certainly embodied that.
He really did. Keep those thoughts churning, folks, because understanding these complex dynamics, the history, the personalities, the pressures, well, that's half the fun. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.